On the 6th of May 2023, a woman walked through Westminster Abbey toward a gilded throne and received a crown. The Archbishop of Canterbury placed it on her head briefly, then exchanged it for a second one, the crown of Queen Mary, reset with diamonds, which she wore for the remainder of the ceremony. The congregation of 2,000 people in the nave watched. The cameras carried it to hundreds of millions more around the world, and the most methodical, most carefully managed, most expensive public relations rehabilitation in the modern history of the British monarchy was complete. The woman was Camilla Parker Bowles. She was 75 years old. She had been the Prince of Wales's acknowledged mistress for the better part of 20 years. The confirmed other woman since the publication of a phone intercept in 1992 that the British tabloid press turned into an event of genuinely national significance, and the person whom Diana, Princess of Wales, had identified by name on live television as the third party in a marriage she described as somewhat crowded. At her lowest point in the mid-1990s, Camilla's car had been pelted with bread rolls outside a London hotel by members of the British public who had recognized her and decided that bread rolls were the appropriate response. Her public approval ratings had sat in numbers that made Buckingham Palace's institutional communications staff genuinely anxious about whether the rehabilitation they were attempting was achievable in any timescale they had available. The bread rolls were a long time ago. She was queen now. What happened in the years between those bread rolls and that crown? And what it cost the people it cost, and the specific mechanisms through which those costs were extracted, and then officially denied, and then named publicly for the first time, by a man whose family found the naming unforgivable, is the account this script addresses. It draws on the documented biographical record of the Wales marriage and its aftermath, on the specific operations of the rehabilitation campaign that began in the late 1990s and continued without interruption through the coronation, on the testimony of journalists, former palace staff, and people inside the relevant social world who provided their accounts to the biographers who examined the 30-year period most carefully, and on one book published in January 2023 that said, in plain English, what the people inside the institution had understood for decades and had each calculated to be safer, left unsaid. The book was spare. The author was Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, the younger son of the king. What he said that the institution found unacceptable was not, as the institution's management of the response preferred people to believe, a set of startling revelations about conduct previously hidden from view. It was the public naming of something that had been understood, in general terms, by everyone inside the relevant institutional world for years. The naming in the form of a published memoir by the king's own son was new. The knowledge being named was not. Nobody with standing had said it before Harry. The question of why nobody had said it, and what that silence produced across 3 decades, is the subject this account builds toward through the documented history that preceded it. Charles Philip Arthur George, Prince of Wales, first encountered Camilla Shand at a polo match in Windsor Great Park in the spring of 1970. He was 21 years old and had recently returned from a period at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he had read archaeology and anthropology and history and had developed, in the opinion of the people who knew him there, into a man of genuine intellectual curiosity and considerable personal insecurity. The two qualities existing simultaneously in the specific combination that the formation of a Prince of Wales produces when that formation is organized around an institution's requirements rather than an individual's development. The formation had not been gentle. Charles had been sent to Gordonstoun in Scotland at the age of 13, the same school where his father had been educated, and which Prince Philip had selected for his son, with the specific conviction of someone who had found the experience formative and valuable, and who had difficulty understanding why his son's experience of the same environment was not producing the same results. The school's educational philosophy, developed by Kurt Hahn, was built around the principle that physical challenge and emotional resilience produced character in ways that comfort and accommodation could not, and its application to the heir to the throne produced, in the accounts of people who knew Charles at school, and in Charles's own retrospective descriptions of the period, an experience he found genuinely difficult. He was required by his position to be treated with deference in the world outside the school. The school's specific culture, organized around the principle that earned respect rather than inherited status, was the only respect worth having, did not reproduce that deference inside its walls. What those years produced in him, alongside the genuine intellectual curiosity and the capacity for sustained personal commitment that his adult life consistently documented, was a specific sensitivity to personal rejection and a specific hunger for the quality of ease in personal relationships that the formal social architecture of his position made difficult to find. The ease Camilla Shand offered him in 1970 was the ease that his specific emotional history made most valuable to him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The formation had not been gentle. Charles had been sent to Gordonstoun in Scotland at the age of 13, a school whose educational philosophy had been built around the principle that physical challenge and hardship produced character in ways that comfort could not, and whose application to the specific child of a reigning monarch had produced, in the accounts of Charles's own recollections of the period, and in the accounts of people who knew him at school, an experience he found genuinely miserable. He described Gordonstoun in later life, in terms recorded by Jonathan Dimbleby in the authorized biography, as days of extreme isolation, of being bullied by boys who recognized that the deference required in his presence outside the school's gates was not required inside them, and of writing letters home to parents who were, for the most specific structural reasons, unavailable to the ordinary comforts a 13-year-old in distress requires from his parents. The Queen was engaged in the daily work of sovereign duty. Prince Philip, whose own Gordonstoun education he had found formative and valuable, had selected the school for his son with the specific conviction of someone who had benefited from it, and who had difficulty understanding why his son was not benefiting in the same way. The result of the formation was a man in his early 20s who was intellectually engaged with the world around him, genuinely curious, capable of the kind of sustained personal warmth that his public image consistently underrepresented, and simultaneously uncertain in the specific ways that a person is uncertain when they have spent their formative years in an institution organized around requirements rather than relationships. He needed approval in a way that the institution's structure had not provided, and that the approval of the people around him, organized as it was around deference to his position rather than genuine assessment of his character, could not adequately supply. Camilla Shand was 22. She was the daughter of Major Bruce Shand, a wine merchant and decorated cavalry officer, who had published a memoir of his wartime experience, and Rosalind Cubitt, and she had been raised inside the specific social world of upper-class rural England, whose parameters were defined by the country house, the hunting field, and the particular conventions about behavior, wit, and social presentation that the English aristocratic class of that era transmitted to its children through the institutions it controlled. She had been educated at Queensgate School in London and at a finishing school in Switzerland, the standard trajectory for a girl of her class and generation. She was not conventionally beautiful in the mode that the women Charles encountered through the formal mechanisms of his social world typically were. She was, by the consistent account of the people who knew her at 22, something more specifically useful than beautiful, which was easy. Easy to talk to, easy to laugh with, easy to be around in the way that people who are genuinely comfortable with themselves produce ease in the people they encounter. She also had, and this is a biographical detail no account of either Charles or Camilla declines to mention, a family history of a particular kind. Her great-grandmother was Alice Keppel, the last acknowledged mistress of King Edward VII, a woman who had occupied her position in the king's life with such discretion and such social intelligence that she had eventually been invited by the king's own wife, Queen Alexandra, to be present at his deathbed. The Keppel connection meant that Camilla grew up in a family that not only moved inside the aristocratic world the royal family inhabited, but that had a specific inherited understanding of the relationship between that world and the institution at its center. She understood, in ways she had absorbed rather than been taught, the specific conventions about what could be acknowledged and what could not. The attraction between Charles and Camilla was real, and was recognized as real by the people who observed them together in the period from 1970 to 1973. Jonathan Dimbleby describes a relationship that produced in Charles a quality of genuine ease that his other personal relationships had not consistently produced. The ease was not a small thing. Charles was not, in the accounts of the people who knew him at 21, a man who found ease readily available in the social contexts his position generated. He was the heir to the throne. The social architecture of that position produced in most of the people he interacted with a deference that replaced the ordinary give and take of social exchange with something more managed and more careful. Camilla did not produce that replacement. She talked to him the way people talk to other people. She teased him. She made him laugh. The novelty of that experience, in his specific life, was considerable. She also had Andrew Parker Bowles. This was not a peripheral biographical detail. It was the central institutional complication that would shape everything that followed. It is also worth noting here, before the account proceeds to that complication, what the relationship between Charles and Camilla represented for both of them in the years before the Parker Bowles marriage complicated it. Two young people in their early 20s found in each other something that the specific circumstances of both their lives had made difficult to find elsewhere. For Charles, the ease that the institutional formation of his life had made scarce. For Camilla, a relationship with someone whose character and intelligence she found genuinely engaging, and whose position, which would have been an overwhelming factor for many people in her social world, she was sufficiently confident in herself to be relatively indifferent to, in the specific sense that she did not organize her behavior around managing his awareness of the position's significance. She treated him, in the accounts of people who observed them together, as a person rather than as the heir to the throne. The distinction was not lost on him. Andrew Parker Bowles was a cavalry officer from a solid Catholic family, whose personal history included a long-standing romantic relationship with Princess Anne, a biographical note that the social world of that era found interesting without finding disqualifying for his eventual marriage to someone else. He was by most accounts a man of considerable personal charm, athletic, socially assured, genuinely good company at the kind of country house events that defined the social calendar of that world. The relationship between Camilla and Parker Bowles had preceded her meeting with Charles and continued alongside it, and its existence constituted the specific problem that the institutional requirements of Charles's position produced when applied to the question of what a relationship with Camilla could eventually become. The institutional requirements had been communicated to Charles by the people whose job it was to communicate such things to princes, and they were not gentle about it. Lord Mountbatten, his great-uncle and one of the most significant personal influences on his young adult life, was among those who communicated most clearly the specific standard required. The woman the Prince of Wales eventually married needed to be young enough to lack the prior romantic history that would produce embarrassing examination, of impeccably respectable family background, and of clean personal history in a very specific sense. Camilla Shand had Andrew Parker Bowles, and the prior relationship was known in their shared social world. The institutional requirements were not suggestions. In 1973, Charles deployed to the Royal Navy for an 8-month tour of duty aboard HMS Minerva. He was 24. The deployment removed him from Britain and from the social world in which his relationship with Camilla had been developing. In his absence, Camilla Shand married Andrew Parker Bowles at the Guards Chapel on the 4th of July 1973. Charles sent a telegram of congratulation from his ship. The gesture was the gesture of someone who understood what the conventions of the social world required in such circumstances, whether or not the conventions corresponded to what the telegram's sender actually felt about the occasion it was congratulating. Charles was at sea. What the news produced in him when it arrived is addressed by Dimbleby's account in the careful language of authorized biography. What it communicates, beneath that language, is that the loss was real. The institutional requirements had prevented a relationship from developing toward the conclusion the people inside it might otherwise have reached, and then the woman had married someone else. She had married Andrew Parker Bowles, who by most contemporary accounts was a man of genuine personal charm and a track record of extramarital conduct that would demonstrate itself across the years of the marriage, with a thoroughness that made the marriage's actual character unambiguous to anyone examining it with sustained attention. The Parker-Bowles marriage produced 2 children, Tom, born in 1974, and Laura, born in 1978. It also produced the specific domestic arrangement that certain marriages of the British upper class of that era produced when 2 people had married partly for institutional reasons and were managing the marriage's formal requirements, alongside private lives that did not correspond to those requirements' terms. Charles's own position across the years from 1973 into the early 1980s was the position of a man attempting to find within the institutional requirements of his life something that met both the institutional need and the personal one. He had other relationships. Anna Wallace, whom he met at a party in 1979, and whose departure from the relationship, reportedly precipitated by his neglect of her at a dance where he spent much of the evening talking with Camilla, told people in their social world that she would not tolerate being treated as secondary to anyone. Lady Sarah Spencer, whose younger sister would eventually marry him. Several others, less dramatically concluded. None of them, in the accounts of the people who knew him during this period, produced in him the quality of ease that Windsor Great Park had produced in 1970. He maintained contact with Camilla through the years of her marriage to Parker Bowles, contact that the biographers examining this period describe in general terms as the contact of 2 people who had found something genuinely valuable in each other and had not found anything that replaced it in the subsequent years. The marriage to Diana Frances Spencer was announced in February 1981. She was 19 years old, he was 32. The age gap was not remarked upon as the concern it might now be understood to represent. It was the age gap that the institutional requirements of that specific historical moment produced, when a 32-year-old prince was required to marry someone without prior significant romantic history. A requirement that, by 1981, substantially narrowed the field to women considerably younger than himself. Diana was, in the institutional terms the requirements applied, exactly right. Young enough to lack the prior romantic history that the requirements found problematic. Of thoroughly appropriate family background, the daughter of Viscount Althorp, who would become the 8th Earl Spencer, and of Frances Roche, whose family had served as ladies-in-waiting to the royal family across generations, with connections to the royal family going back through multiple lines of descent, of personal character that informal examinations had found unimpeachable. She was also, in ways the institutional assessment had not fully captured, a young woman whose emotional formation had produced specific vulnerabilities that the institutional environment she was about to enter was not equipped to support. Her parents had divorced when she was 6 years old, in circumstances that were painful by any measure. Her mother, Frances, had left her father, Viscount Althorp, for another man, the wallpaper heir Peter Shand Kidd, and the subsequent custody battle had been contested through the courts in a manner that left all 3 Spencer children with the specific emotional marks that contested divorces in prominent families leave in children who grow up observing their parents fight over them and cannot fully understand what they are watching. Her mother lost the custody case, an outcome that was unusual for the era, and that Diana's maternal grandmother Ruth, Lady Fermoy, who was a close friend of the Queen Mother, was understood to have influenced by providing testimony that did not support her own daughter's case. Diana spent her childhood primarily with her father and with successive stepmothers, one of whom, Rain Spencer, became a figure of genuine personal tension within the family and a source of emotional difficulty that Diana described in the Morton recordings without restraint. She had been educated at a series of schools, with results that she later characterized as undistinguished, and had failed her O-levels twice. She had come to London in her late teens and worked in a nursery school and as a part-time aide at a kindergarten, occupations that the people who employed her described as ones she approached with a genuine warmth toward the children she looked after. She was 19 years old, in the first years of independent adult life, when the engagement was announced. The engagement announcement was made at Buckingham Palace on the 24th of February, 1981. The television interview that accompanied it has been examined by more commentators across more decades than almost any comparable piece of footage in British public life, specifically for one exchange. When a reporter asked whether they were in love, Diana said immediately yes, of course. Charles said yes, whatever love means. The qualification received almost no analytical attention at the time. The world was more interested in Diana's sapphire and diamond engagement ring, selected by Diana herself from a catalogue of options the palace jeweler had provided, and in the details of the forthcoming wedding. The qualifier was the honest thing Charles said in the interview. Nobody who was looking for honest things was listening for them in February 1981. What Diana's choice of that ring later came to represent in the accounts of the marriage's failure is an illustration of how the personal choices of people inside an institution acquire retrospective significance in the light of what those people subsequently experience. The ring was a sapphire surrounded by diamonds. It was available in the jeweler's catalog because it was not a bespoke commission in the tradition of earlier royal engagement rings. It was something Diana had seen and liked. It became, across the years following the engagement, the most photographed piece of jewelry in the world, worn by a woman whose public life across the following decade would document the specific costs of the choice the ring was meant to celebrate. After Diana's death, it passed to her older son, who gave it to Catherine Middleton on their engagement in 2010, a detail that press coverage noted with the specific emotional weight that royal jewelry carries when it has belonged to someone who has died, and then passes to their child for their own marriage. The wedding produced the photographs that defined an entire generation's understanding of what a royal wedding was and what it was supposed to mean. The waving from the balcony, the RAF flyover, the unprecedented kiss that the crowd's cheering appeared to produce on cue, though the decision to kiss and the specific timing of it were managed rather than spontaneous in the way the image suggested. The photographs were produced by the institutional machinery that surrounds a royal wedding, cameras positioned for the shots the institution needed taken, the visual record managed toward the specific account of the occasion that the institution required. What happened alongside those photographs in the years of the marriage that followed is the account that the photographs were produced to prevent from being the dominant public record of what the marriage was. The first years of the marriage were not uniformly miserable in the account that the people closest to Diana provide. There were real moments of genuine connection and real instances of two people trying to make something work under conditions that neither of them had fully understood when they committed to the attempt. Diana's early charitable engagements produced in her, by the accounts of the people who accompanied her on them, a quality of genuine connection with the people she was meeting that had not been manufactured by the palace's public relations machinery. She was good at the work. She had an instinctive emotional attunement to the people she encountered in hospital wards and children's homes and community centers that the palace's more formal conception of charitable engagement had not prepared it for, and that produced coverage organized around a quality of personal connection that was uncommon in the coverage of royal charitable visits. The coverage was not managed in any conventional sense. It emerged from who Diana actually was in those settings. William's birth in June 1982, produced in Charles, by the accounts of the people who observed him in that period, a genuine joy that was not performed. Harry's birth in September 1984, similarly. The children were real, and the attachment to them was real. But the private reality of the marriage was the private reality documented in the Morton recordings and in the accounts of the people who were inside the household during those years. The bulimia that began in the period of the engagement persisted across the decade. The sense of institutional isolation, of being inside a machinery organized around requirements she could not always understand and had not been prepared for, persisted. The awareness of Camilla's presence in Charles's life persisted because the situation that had produced that awareness had not changed. The wedding took place at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 29th of July 1981. 600,000 people lined the processional route. 750 million watched on television in 74 countries. Diana's gown, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, had a 25-foot train of ivory silk taffeta and old lace. Charles wore the full dress uniform of a naval commander. The photographs produced from the occasion defined, for the entire generation that received them, the specific visual language of the romantic royal marriage. The waving from the balcony, the RAF flyover, the unprecedented kiss that the crowds cheering appeared to produce on cue. Camilla Parker Bowles attended the wedding. She was among the congregation. The specific weight of that fact requires no elaboration. The woman whose relationship with the groom had been present in his life for a decade sat in the church and watched him marry Diana Spencer. Diana knew who Camilla was. She had found the bracelet. Before the wedding, Diana had discovered a bracelet that Charles had ordered engraved with the initials GF, which she understood to refer to the private nickname Girl Friday that Charles and Camilla used between themselves. The Morton recordings contain her description of the discovery and what it produced in her. She had confronted Charles. He had dismissed her concern. The bracelet was delivered to Camilla several days before the wedding. The wedding proceeded as planned. The Morton recordings are the most significant primary documents in this account's subject matter, and it is worth being specific about what they are and how they were produced. Diana made them beginning in 1991, speaking alone into a tape recorder in her apartment at Kensington Palace, answering questions written by Andrew Morton and delivered through her friend and former fellow patient James Colthurst, who had been introduced to Morton and who served as intermediary throughout the collaboration. Diana and Morton never met face-to-face during the production of the biography that used the recordings as its foundation. The mechanism was deliberate. Diana could not simply meet Morton for recorded interviews. The palace's administrative and security apparatus would have produced a record of such meetings. The tape mechanism allowed her to create a documentary account of her experience while maintaining the specific plausible deniability that the institutional environment required. When Diana, Her True Story was published on the 7th of June 1992, it named Camilla Parker Bowles. It described the affair in specific terms. Not in the euphemistic terms that the palace preferred, but in the terms that a wife describing her husband's relationship with another woman uses when she has decided to stop managing the description toward institutional convenience. It described Diana's bulimia and her suicide attempts. It described the specific experience of institutional isolation, of being inside the machinery of the royal household without the emotional support that the machinery was not organized to provide. The book sold 100,000 copies on its first day. Within weeks, it had sold several 100,000 copies in Britain and was selling in comparable numbers across multiple international markets. The scale of the commercial response was evidence of the public's hunger for the account that the managed coverage of the preceding 11 years had withheld. An account of the marriage from the perspective of the person inside it, who had not been given a public voice in the managed account. The palace's official response was dismissal. The book was unauthorized, a fiction, assembled without Diana's genuine cooperation. The denial was available because the specific mechanism of the tape recordings allowed it to be maintained in the technical sense that no document showed Diana formally authorizing the collaboration. The denial was also, in the specific way that denials of this kind are, a statement that the people receiving it who knew about the tapes and who had access to the biographers and researchers who had examined the recordings found unconvincing. The recordings existed. Morton had them. The palace knew they existed and chose not to confirm that knowledge in the denial, because confirming it would have confirmed the book's specific evidentiary basis in the most direct available terms. The Morton book was therefore the first occasion on which the palace confronted the specific problem that Harry's spare would eventually present in a more acute form. An account of the institution's private reality from a source inside the institution, placed in the permanent public record in a form that the institution's denial could not entirely remove from that record, and that the institution could manage through non-specific dismissal, but not through the specific documentary rebuttal that would have required confirming the existence of the evidence the denial was denying. Diana, Her True Story was published on the 7th of June 1992. It named Camilla Parker Bowles. It described the affair in specific terms, not in the euphemistic terms that the palace preferred, but in the terms that a wife describing her husband's relationship with another woman uses when she has decided to stop managing the description toward institutional convenience. It described Diana's bulimia and her suicide attempts. Ribed was the marriage from inside the experience of the person who was most directly affected by its specific character. The bracelet. The phone calls at hours that were not hours for ordinary calls. The patterns in the household's social calendar that the people inside the household understood to mean something that the household's official account did not acknowledge. The specific conversations in which Diana had raised what she understood to be happening and the responses those conversations produced. The development of her bulimia, which began in the first year of the marriage, she dated its beginning to the week after the engagement announcement, when she first began the cycle of binge eating and purging that would persist across the following decade. The palace was aware of this, in the sense that the people managing Diana's domestic life could not be unaware of it. The awareness did not produce intervention in any form Diana experienced as adequate to what she was experiencing. The wedding had happened. The fairy tale had been published to 750 million people, and the person who had been in Charles's life for a decade continued, in the years that followed, to be in his life. The fairy tale's 750 million viewers did not know this. Many of the people inside the institution did. The British press of the 1980s knew about Charles and Camilla. This is a documented fact, stated explicitly in the memoirs and retrospective accounts of the royal correspondents who worked the beat across those years. James Whittaker of the Daily Mirror knew. Harry Arnold of The Sun knew. The editors of the major tabloids possessed information, through their own networks of sources inside the palace's social world, that was more than rumor. The Royal Press Corps was a small professional community, with deep connections inside the social world that surrounded the palace. And that social world was not successfully concealing what was happening in Charles's private life from people who had spent careers developing sources inside it. They did not print it. The reasons they did not print it are the reasons that institutional silences are maintained, and they are worth examining individually because the same categories of reasons appear throughout the 30-year history this account describes, and because the same categories of calculation produced Harry's silence before his eventual departure changed the terms of the calculation. The specific knowledge the Royal Press Corps possessed in the mid-1980s is documented in enough retrospective accounts to establish its general character, even though the specific details of what each individual correspondent knew at each specific moment cannot be established with documentary precision from the accounts available. Whittaker, who published his own memoir of his years as a royal correspondent, described the period in terms that confirm the general picture. A small professional community with extensive source networks inside the palace's social world, a community that knew more than it published on several significant subjects, and a community whose professional culture organized itself around the calculation of what could and could not be printed, rather than around the unconstrained pursuit of what was true. The calculation was not cynical in a simple sense. The correspondents of that era genuinely believed, most of them, most of the time, that the palace's cooperation with their coverage was a public good as well as a professional good. That the monarch and the royal family occupied an institutional role in British public life that was better maintained through a degree of mutual management between the palace and the press than it would be if the press pursued every angle its knowledge permitted. The coverage conventions of that era were the product of a genuine institutional relationship rather than simply of commercial calculation, and the correspondations that the people inside those conventions made were made within a framework that had its own internal logic, even when the external consequences of that logic were the concealment from the British public of significant information about the people that the public's money and deference were sustaining. Diana was the specific person most directly harmed by the outcome of that institutional logic. She was inside a marriage whose private reality the press knew about and declined to describe, and she was inside that marriage in the specific isolation that the palace's management of her situation produced, without the external accountability that public knowledge of the situation would have created for the people managing it. The press's silence was not directed at her. It was directed at the institution of the monarchy, which the press had decided required the specific management of its coverage that the conventions provided. But the silence's practical effect, for Diana specifically, was the effect of a person in a damaging situation being denied the external visibility that might have changed the terms of the situation. They did not print it. The reasons they did not print it are the reasons that institutional silences are maintained, and they are worth examining individually because the same categories of reasons appear throughout the 30-year history this account describes, and because the same categories of calculation produced Harry's silence before his eventual departure changed the terms of the calculation. The first reason was access. The royal correspondents' professional value to their editors depended on their relationship with the palace's press office, a relationship that provided access to official events, briefings from royal staff, and the specific information channels that made their coverage of the royal family possible and made their positions as royal correspondents professionally sustainable. Printing what the relationship's maintenance required not to be printed would have ended the relationship. The professional cost of ending the relationship was the cost of becoming unable to do the job the position required. That cost was prohibitive for most editors who performed the calculation. The second reason was the informal convention that governed royal coverage in the British press of that era. The convention was not codified. It was not a legal agreement. It was the accumulated practice of decades of royal journalism, organized around the understanding that the palace's cooperation was contingent on a specific standard of coverage, and that the standard excluded the private romantic lives of the royal family's members from the category of stories the relationship permitted. The convention was enforced through the same access relationships whose loss constituted the first reason. The two reasons were therefore mutually reinforcing. The convention existed because the access was valuable, and the access was maintained because the convention was observed. The third reason was the collective action problem. Each individual outlet that declined to print the story was making a calculation that included the behavior of its competitors. Breaking the convention to print the story carried the full professional cost of losing access while offering no guarantee of being first with a story that competitors with the same knowledge were managing under the same calculation. The rational individual choice in that situation was the choice that produced the collective silence. Diana was inside that silence. She was the person most directly affected by what the silence was protecting, and she had the least institutional power to break it. She was the Princess of Wales, a position of extraordinary public visibility and very limited actual institutional authority. The constitutional position of a princess consort carries no specific formal powers. It is defined by convention and personal relationship rather than by formal authority. And Diana's capacity to change the terms of the situation she was in through institutional channels was severely constrained. The marriage that the public was watching across the 1980s was not entirely without real content. William was born in June 1982. Harry was born in September 1984. There were official tours, the Australian tour of 1983, during which the public response to Diana was of a scale and warmth that Charles's office found difficult to entirely conceal, producing a note of institutional discomfort alongside the official celebration. There were official engagements. There were the charitable patronages that Diana accumulated and that she engaged with in a way that the people who observed her work described as genuine rather than performed. The photographs of those years show two people in each other's company performing the public requirements of their shared institutional position. The accounts of the people inside the household are accounts of something else happening alongside the performance. Paul Burrell, Diana's butler from 1987 until her death, eventually published two memoirs that addressed the marriage's private reality. Patrick Jepson, her private secretary from 1988 to 1996, published his own account in 2000. The household staff who worked in the residences where the family lived, Kensington Palace, Highgrove, Sandringham, Balmoral, described, to the biographers who interviewed them across the years following Diana's death, the private reality of two people managing the public performance while inhabiting private lives that had separated in directions the public was not aware of. Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles continued across the years of the marriage. This is the documented fact that the accounts of Dimbleby, Brown, Lacey, Morton, and the other biographers who examined this period most carefully establish. The specific form the continuation took, the specific occasions, the specific arrangements, the specific knowledge of whom within the household staff and the protection officer team understood what, is documented with varying degrees of specificity across those accounts. What is common to all of them is the basic fact of the continuation. Diana was aware. She had been aware since before the wedding. The knowledge accumulated across the years of the marriage in the forms that a wife accumulates knowledge about a husband's other attachment, not through investigation, but through the ordinary domestic evidence of shared space. Phone calls at hours that were not hours for ordinary calls. Patterns in the social calendar. The specific guest lists at country house weekends. The specific occasions whose arrangements, understood by someone who knew what to look for, told the story that the public account was not telling. Her attempts to address this through the mechanisms the marriage permitted produced the responses she describes in the Morton recordings: dismissal, or the specific form of engagement that consists of denying the reality the person raising it has accurately identified. The institutional environment around her was not a sympathetic one for raising the matter. The palace's machinery was organized around the maintenance of the public presentation rather than the resolution of the private reality. And the communications between Diana and the people in that machinery, when she attempted to communicate what she was experiencing, produced responses calibrated to the maintenance requirement rather than to her actual situation. She began, across the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, to make the decisions about what she knew that would eventually change the terms of the public conversation. The Morton collaboration has been described above. The outcome of that collaboration was Diana, Her True Story, published in June 1992. The book named Camilla Parker Bowles. It described the affair in specific terms, not in the euphemistic terms that the palace preferred, but in the terms that a wife describing her husband's relationship with another woman uses when she has decided to stop managing the description toward institutional convenience. It described Diana's bulimia and her suicide attempts. It described the marriage's private reality from the inside in terms that the palace had never been required to address because the terms had never previously appeared in print from a source as primary as the Princess of Wales. The palace's official response was dismissal. The book was unauthorized, a fiction, assembled without Diana's genuine cooperation. The deniability that the tape mechanism had been designed to produce was deployed. Diana went on the radio shortly after publication and said she had not cooperated with Morton. She was speaking in the technical sense that no formal authorization document existed. The recordings that had produced every word in the book were in Morton's possession. The palace could not produce an adequate counter-account that addressed the book's specific detail in the specific terms the detail required, and the inadequacy of the counter-account was its own form of confirmation. That same month, June 1992, Charles and Diana separated, in the practical sense that they stopped attempting to maintain even the appearance of a shared domestic life. By December 1992, the Prime Minister John Major announced in the House of Commons that the Prince and Princess of Wales had agreed to separate. The announcement was the formal public acknowledgement of what the people inside the institution had understood for years. 5 days after the separation announcement, a transcript of a private telephone conversation was published in an Australian tabloid called New Idea and swiftly reprinted across the British press. The call had been recorded at some point in 1989, reportedly by a radio ham whose equipment had accidentally intercepted the mobile signal on which the call was being made. It had apparently been circulating in narrow circles within the British press and intelligence communities for years before its December 1992 publication. The specific timing of its emergence, occurring within days of the formal separation announcement, was a timing whose precise cause has never been definitively established in the public record. The effect, however, is entirely established. The call was between Charles and Camilla. It was a long conversation between two people entirely at ease with each other, speaking in the specific language of a relationship of many years' standing. The call was explicit. It was also in the specific way that private conversations between people who are genuinely comfortable with each other are, completely devoid of the formal register that Charles's public communications maintained. The contents confirmed what the Morton book had described in attributed testimony, and did so in a register that attributed testimony could never match. Not someone else's account of the relationship, but the relationship's own voice, recorded and published. The British tabloids named it Camillagate. The phrasing was deliberate. It borrowed from the Watergate suffix that had become shorthand for institutional scandal, applying it to a personal revelation in a move that placed the relationship's exposure in the category of public significance that the suffix implied. The specific content of the tape that the coverage dwelt on was content that was explicit enough to be quoted in the tabloids, with the combination of discretion and specificity that the tabloid management of explicit material produces. Enough detail to convey the nature of the conversation without reproducing every specific word in a publication that maintained certain nominal standards of decency. The coverage conveyed the general character of what had been recorded, which was sufficient for the coverage's purpose. The coverage's purpose was to confirm, in the most direct available form, what the Morton book had described in attributed testimony, that the relationship between Charles and Camilla was a relationship whose intimacy was of the kind that the formal account of the Prince of Wales's marriage had required to not be acknowledged. What the coverage also conveyed, though the conveying was less deliberate and less organized than the coverage of the explicit content, was the specific quality of the relationship that the tape documented. The two people speaking were entirely at ease with each other. They were not managing a conversation. They were not performing a relationship. They were in the middle of a conversation of the kind that people in long and genuine relationships have, the kind of conversation that references shared private understandings and shared private language, and the specific familiarity of people who know each other very well and who communicate with each other in ways that do not require the management that the communications of people who are still establishing their relationship require. The coverage of the explicit content received most of the press attention. The quality of ease between the two people received less attention. But the quality of ease was the evidence that the most thoughtful commentators noted at the time, because it was the evidence that told something about what Charles had found in the relationship that the marriage was not providing, and that therefore told something about why the marriage had produced the consequences the Morton book had described. The ease was the thing that had been present in Windsor Great Park in 1970, and that had not been replicated in anything the institutional requirements of the preceding decade had produced in Charles's life. The tape captured it. It was available for anyone who listened past the explicit content to the quality of the communication itself. The British tabloids named it Camillagate. The phrasing was deliberate. It borrowed from the Watergate suffix that had become shorthand for institutional scandal, applying it to a personal revelation in a move that placed the relationship's exposure in the category of public significance that the suffix implied. The coverage was extensive and was organized around the specific register of outrage and revelation that the tabloid press deploys when a story confirms what the coverage's audience had been invited to suspect without being given official confirmation. Camilla Parker Bowles, who had been known by name to close followers of royal affairs and essentially unknown to the general public, became known to the general public in the most direct available terms, not through someone else's description of her role in the Wales marriage, but through her own recorded voice in a private conversation. The confirmation produced what it produced. Not surprise, but the specific displacement of a willed not knowing by an unwanted certainty. The British public had been living with the public account of the Wales marriage, the account the palace and the press had collaborated to maintain across 11 years. The Morton book had introduced the first major crack in that account. The Camillagate tape removed the account entirely. There was no longer a version of the Wales marriage whose private reality could be maintained as genuinely uncertain. The tape had ended the uncertainty with the finality of evidence that is not attributed to a source and cannot be dismissed as someone else's account of events they did not witness. It was the events themselves, recorded. The years that followed the tape's publication, through to Diana's death in August 1997, were the years in which the public account of the Wales marriage was replaced, piece by piece, by the account that the Morton book and the tape and the panorama interview assembled together. The replacement was not comfortable for the institution, not comfortable for Charles, and not comfortable for a British public that had been invested, through genuine warmth toward both Charles and Diana, through the specific emotional investment that the wedding of 1981 had produced in an audience of 750 million people, in a version of the story that the evidence now showed to be a performance rather than a reality. What the documentary record of the Wales marriage shows, assembled from the independent sources that examined it most carefully, is not the fairy tale that the institutional management of 1981 presented, and not the villain narrative that the tabloid press of the early 1990s produced. It is the story of an institution managing two people whose private realities were incompatible with each other, and with the public account the institution required to be maintained, through a set of mechanisms whose specific operations this account has described, and of the costs those mechanisms produced for the people inside them who were not the institution's primary management concern. The institution's primary management concern was the monarchy. Diana was a member of the monarchy's family. Her welfare mattered to the institution in the specific way that the welfare of a person matters to an institution when that person's welfare affects the institution's management requirements, instrumentally rather than as an end in itself. The distinction between instrumental concern and genuine concern is the distinction that Diana's own account of her experience inside the institution consistently documents. The confirmation produced what it produced. Not surprise, but the specific displacement of a willed not knowing by an unwanted certainty. The British public had been living with the public account of the Wales marriage, which was the account the palace and the press had collaborated to maintain across 11 years. And the account had required a suspension of disbelief that the public had largely maintained because the institution of the monarchy was one it broadly supported, and the suspension of disbelief was the price of that support. The Camillagate tape ended the suspension with a finality that the Morton book, for all its significance, had not entirely achieved, because the Morton book's deniability had maintained a sliver of space for doubt. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Camilla Parker Bowles was, in the terms of the British tabloid press, through the months that followed the tape's publication, and extending through the following years, the villain of the story. The assignment was not without basis. She had knowingly participated in a sustained relationship with a married man whose wife was directly suffering from the relationship's existence, and the suffering was now documented in a published biography that had sold in enormous numbers and that the palace had failed to effectively refute. The villain assignment was also, in the way that simple villain assignments in complex situations typically are, incomplete. It removed Charles from the accounting in ways that the actual distribution of responsibility did not support. Charles was the Prince of Wales. He had made choices. He had married Diana under the circumstances this account has described, and he had continued the relationship with Camilla across the years of the marriage because he had chosen to, and the choice had been his. The institutional factors that constrained his options were real institutional factors, but they were factors operating on a man who retained the capacity to make choices within them. The tabloid coverage did not produce a nuanced accounting. It produced the narrative structure that the available material most efficiently supported, which was the structure of a wronged princess and a scheming other woman, because that structure was the one that sold most readily to an audience that had been encouraged across 11 years to invest emotionally in the princess's side of the story. Camilla received the villain role. The heir to the throne was spared the equivalent. Diana's own public naming of the situation came on the 20th of November 1995, when Martin Bashir's panorama interview with her was broadcast on BBC One. The audience of 22.8 million people watching that evening was the largest British television audience for a news or documentary program in the years since the Falklands War. The interview has been examined by more analysts, replayed on more retrospective occasions, and quoted in more subsequent accounts than almost any comparable piece of British television. The controversy that subsequently emerged about Bashir's methods, the BBC inquiry of 2021 that found he had used forged bank statements to convince Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, that people close to Diana were being paid to spy on her, and that the BBC had then covered up what had been found by an internal inquiry in 1996, is a real and significant institutional story that matters for the question of how the interview was obtained. It does not alter the content of what Diana said on camera. Her words were her own. Her account was consistent with what she had told Morton, consistent with what the people closest to her had been hearing across the years, and consistent with the documentary record in the respects that the record could confirm. She confirmed the affair with Camilla directly, by name. She described her own relationship with James Hewitt, former lifeguards officer, with the directness that the institution around her found genuinely alarming in its specificity. She questioned, with a precision that surprised even some of her allies, whether Charles was suited for the role of king, not the role of Prince of Wales, but the specific demands of the kingship itself. She described in considerable detail the institutional hostility she had experienced as a working member of the royal family, the specific ways in which the machinery around her had been organized against rather than in support of her functioning effectively in her official role. And she produced the line that would follow both Charles and Camilla for the rest of their public lives, and that has become one of the most quoted sentences in the modern history of the British royal family. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she said, "so it was a bit crowded." The phrase was not a villain accusation, it was arithmetic. 3 people in a space designed for 2 is a structural observation rather than a moral judgment of the third person. Diana named 3 parties. She was one of them. The phrase is not remembered as a statement of nuance, but it was one. The specific content of the Panorama interview that produced the most concentrated institutional alarm was not the confirmation of the affair, which had already been established in the Morton book and in the Camillagate tape, and whose reconfirmation was the least surprising element of the broadcast. What the institutional environment found most alarming was Diana's specific questioning of Charles's suitability for the kingship, and her precise description of how the institutional environment inside the royal household had worked against her. On the question of the kingship, Diana said on camera that she would like to see Charles become a good ambassador to the country, rather than suggesting the role of king was one he had the qualities to occupy. The formulation was understood to be precise by everyone who heard it. A woman who had spent 15 years inside the institutional environment of the British monarchy, who had observed its workings from a position closer than almost anyone outside the working family itself, was saying in the specific register of someone who knew what she was talking about, that the heir to the throne lacked a specific quality the role required. The palace's advisors found the specific precision of the formulation more alarming than a cruder attack would have been. A crude attack could be dismissed. The precision was harder to manage because it communicated the knowledge of an insider. On the institutional environment's treatment of her, she described specific incidents whose recognizable quality made the people inside the palace's machinery who heard them uncomfortable in the specific way of people who recognize themselves or their colleagues in an account they would have preferred not to be in the public record. She did not name individuals. She described dynamics. The dynamics were recognizable to the people who had operated within them. The Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana shortly after the broadcast, requesting that they divorce. The letter was the institutional acknowledgement that the management of the marriage's situation through its existing mechanisms had reached the end of what those mechanisms could produce. The divorce was announced in February 1996 and finalized in August 1996. Diana retained the title Princess of Wales and lost the designation Royal Highness. Charles retained his position unchanged. Camilla Parker Bowles had divorced Andrew Parker Bowles in 1995, a year before Charles and Diana's divorce was finalized. The timing was noted. Diana died in Paris on the 31st of August 1997 in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at approximately 12:23 in the morning. She was 36 years old. She had been in Paris with Dodi Fayed, and the relationship had been public knowledge for approximately 6 weeks. The grief that followed has been documented more extensively than this account can match. What matters here is its specific implication for Camilla's position. The grief was organized around a woman who had been publicly established, through Morton, through Panorama, through a decade of tabloid coverage of the marriage's collapse, as the person who had suffered the specific injury that Camilla's presence had contributed to causing. The grief carried within it, as a component of its structure rather than its surface presentation, a specific attitude toward Camilla that was the most hostile the British public had yet produced about her. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The public response to the royal family's initial management of Diana's death, the Queen's delayed return from Balmoral, the absence of a flag at half-mast above Buckingham Palace, the perceived institutional coldness toward a woman who had been loved by enormous numbers of ordinary people, produced the most concentrated single period of public hostility toward the monarchy in the post-war era. Camilla Parker Bowles, whose name was not central to the coverage of those specific days, but who was present in the periphery of the public conversation as the person associated with the marriage's collapse, spent the weeks following the death essentially invisible. That was the appropriate response of someone who understood precisely what the public mood of those weeks meant for her position. What followed in the years after Diana's death was the most concentrated and most methodically documented institutional image management campaign the modern British royal family has produced. Mark Bolland joined the Prince of Wales's office in 1996 as Deputy Private Secretary. His background at the Press Complaints Commission gave him a precise understanding of how the relationship between the British press and the people the press covered was managed in formal and informal terms, and whose usefulness to the Prince of Wales's specific situation was obvious to the people who hired him. The specific situation Bolland inherited was the situation of an heir to the throne whose public image was inseparable from the documentation of a failed marriage, and whose continued relationship with the woman publicly identified as the cause of that failure made any rehabilitation of his public standing contingent on rehabilitating hers. The two images were linked in the public mind in ways that made them practically impossible to manage separately. The Camillagate tape had produced the linkage. Every piece of coverage that mentioned one of them implicitly referenced the other. Bolland's strategy became, across the years from approximately 1998 to 2003, one of the more documented cases of institutional image management in the modern history of British public relations. The documentation exists because the strategy's existence was known to journalists who observed its operations from inside the press world, because several of the people involved in its implementation described it in published accounts, and because the biographers who examined Charles's public life across this period had access to enough independent accounts of the strategy's workings to produce a documented picture of what it was doing and how. Tina Brown, whose 2007 book The Diana Chronicles drew on extensive research and on interviews with people inside the relevant world, describes the rehabilitation operation in terms that give it the character of a sustained institutional production managed through specific press relationships with specific publications. Robert Lacey, whose biographical work on the royal family drew on comparable sources, describes the same operation in comparable terms. The accounts across the independent biographies of this period are consistent enough in their broad characterization that the general shape of what the operation was and how it worked is established in the public record. The strategy had several distinct components that the documented accounts describe in enough specific detail to constitute a picture of the overall operation. The first was the management of specific press relationships that the Prince of Wales's office maintained with the British tabloids. Those relationships provided the publications with access to official events and background briefings from palace sources in exchange for the kind of coverage those access arrangements implicitly encouraged. The management of those relationships was directed, in the rehabilitation strategy's terms, toward producing coverage of Camilla organized around qualities other than the affair. She was charitable. She was warm and unpretentious. She was devoted to Charles. She was good company in the social settings she inhabited. She was an engaged and caring stepmother figure to his sons. These characterizations were communicated to journalists through the access arrangements, and they produced coverage organized around those qualities rather than around the history. The second component was the staging of public appearances designed to produce specific coverage outcomes. The first time Charles and Camilla appeared together in circumstances that could be photographed in the post-Diana period was not an accident. They left the same private party in January 1999, a 50th birthday celebration for Camilla's sister Annabelle Elliot, and were photographed by press photographers who had been positioned to photograph them. The specific party, the specific timing, the specific photographic opportunity were arranged. The coverage the photographs produced was the coverage that a managed public reintroduction is designed to produce. Coverage of an event, rather than a scandal, organized around the fact of the appearance, rather than the history that preceded it. Bolland was known in certain press circles by a nickname whose literary reference was to a fictional character renowned for strategic cunning and indirection, a characterization that the people who dealt with him found accurate rather than offensive. He operated through suggestion and managed information flow rather than direct confrontation. The management of the information flow was the specific instrument through which the rehabilitation's early stages were accomplished. The provision of positive material about Camilla to the publications whose coverage of her the palace's access relationships could reach, producing a coverage pattern that shifted over months and years, from uniformly hostile toward something more ambivalent, and then toward something that, while not enthusiastically positive, was no longer organized primarily around the affair and its consequences. The staged public appearances escalated in their formality as the coverage's character shifted. The first official joint public appearance followed the 1999 photographs. What is documented about the specific operations of the rehabilitation campaign in the period from 1999 to 2005 is documented across the independent accounts of biographers and journalists who were observing those operations from the outside, with varying degrees of access to the people managing them. The picture that emerges from those accounts is the picture of a sustained and methodical operation that understood the specific mechanics of how British public opinion about a public figure shifts and was managing those mechanics with professional competence. The specific mechanics that the operation understood were the mechanics of coverage accumulation. A single article about Camilla's warmth does not change the public's view of a person whose public identity has been formed around 3 decades of coverage, organized around a different set of qualities. 10 articles, appearing across 6 months in publications of varying types and audiences, begin to produce a coverage pattern whose accumulation has effects that no single article could produce. 100 articles across 3 years, consistent in their characterization and appearing in the full range of publications from the broadsheets to the tabloids to the magazines, whose readerships are organized around different demographics with different relationships to the original hostile narrative. That accumulation produces the specific shift in the ambient coverage that eventually shifts the public's understanding of who the person is. The operation managed that accumulation with a consistency and a patience that the people who observed it from the press world subsequently described as the specific quality that distinguished it from less effective institutional image management campaigns of comparable ambition. The patience was necessary because the timescale required was a timescale that conventional press management campaigns are not organized around. Most press management campaigns operate on timescales of weeks or months. The rehabilitation of Camilla Parker Bowles required a timescale of years, because the hostility to be overcome was the hostility produced by 30 years of history rather than by a single incident, and the timescale of the history determined the minimum timescale of its management. The specific people who were brought into the management across its different phases are documented with varying degrees of specificity in the accounts of the period. Bolland is the most prominently documented, for the reasons discussed above. After his departure, the operations continued under the management of the communications staff, who had been recruited to Charles's household across the years of his tenure, and who had absorbed the operating principles of the campaign as part of the institutional culture of the household they were working in. The culture persisted because the culture had been effective, and effective institutional practices persist, not because they are explicitly maintained, but because the people who benefited from them continue to employ them in the ordinary course of doing the job the practices have been developed to do. The coverage of Camilla in the British press across the period from approximately 2002 to 2010 shows the accumulation's effect in the coverage record, a gradual shift in the characterizations that appear in coverage of her official engagements, in the register of the coverage of her relationship with Charles, in the absence of the Camillagate references that had accompanied every mention of her name in the years immediately following its publication. The shift is not uniform, and it is not complete by 2010. But it is real, and it is documented in the coverage record, and the coverage record is the most direct available evidence that the accumulation was producing the effects the operation had been organized to produce. The first official joint public appearance followed the 1999 photographs, then the first occasion explicitly identified as a couple in press coverage. Then the first meeting with the Queen herself, a private occasion at Windsor Castle in 1999, whose occurrence was communicated through channels that produced the press coverage it was intended to produce, without requiring a formal palace statement that would have required the palace to officially address what it had previously been officially silent about. The campaign generated concerns inside Charles's household from people who understood what it was doing and who had varying views about whether the methods were appropriate to the institution's long-term interests. The specific concern was not primarily moral, it was the institutional concern of people who understood that the same mechanisms could be deployed in different directions by different people, and that an institution comfortable with managed press operations was an institution comfortable with something whose outcomes it could not always predict or control. The concern did not stop the campaign. It continued through Boleyn's time in the household and beyond it. Boleyn left Charles's household in 2002. His departure removed the most prominent individual architect of the rehabilitation from its active management, but it did not remove the institutional infrastructure he had built, the press relationships, the access arrangements, the communications habits embedded in the palace's own apparatus. What he left behind was a functional system for managing the relationship between the Prince of Wales's office and the British press in the direction the rehabilitation required. The system did not depend on his presence to continue operating. Institutional practices of this kind become embedded in the way an organization does its business, rather than residing in the expertise of a single individual. Charles and Camilla married on the 8th of April 2005 at Windsor's Guildhall in a civil ceremony. The original date of April 9th had been moved by 1 day after the death of Pope John Paul II, required members of the royal family to attend his funeral on that date. A piece of scheduling contingency that produced coverage, noting, with varying degrees of irony, that the Catholic Church had managed to delay the wedding of a man who was divorcing his first wife to marry a divorced woman through the death of the leader of a religion that does not recognize divorce by a single day. The Duchess of Cornwall, as Camilla's title became on marriage, would not be known as Princess of Wales. That title's association with Diana was considered too politically sensitive. When Charles eventually became king, the palace had announced in 2005, Camilla would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen Consort. This 2005 announcement was subsequently reversed. In February 2022, Buckingham Palace issued a statement marking the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, in which the late Queen expressed what the statement described as her sincere wish that when the time came, Camilla should be known as Queen Consort. The reversal of the 2005 position was framed as the Queen's personal wish, a framing that gave the decision the weight of royal endorsement and reduced the political space available for public objection, since objecting required objecting to the expressed preference of a 95-year-old woman who had reigned for 70 years and whose personal authority on questions of institutional preference was not easily contested. The specific circumstances of the 2005 wedding illustrate the degree to which the rehabilitation's requirements had been internalized by the institutional management by the time it produced the wedding. The civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall was preceded by weeks of public discussion organized around whether the marriage was appropriate in terms of Church of England convention, specifically, whether the heir to the throne, who would one day be Supreme Governor of the Church of England, could appropriately marry a divorced person. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, navigated the question in a way that produced a formal blessing in St. George's Chapel immediately following the civil ceremony, while declining to conduct the civil ceremony himself. The navigation was the navigation of an institution managing competing requirements simultaneously. The years between the 2005 wedding and the 2022 announcement were the years during which Camilla established herself in the working royal role that the rehabilitation had spent the preceding decade creating the conditions for. She acquired charitable patronages, her work around literacy, which became one of her most sustained commitments, and her work around domestic abuse, where she spoke publicly and specifically in ways that gave the charitable commitment the character of genuine engagement rather than institutional performance. She developed a public persona organized around warmth and accessibility, and a self-deprecating humor that the people who covered her official engagements found genuinely appealing in ways that made coverage organized around those qualities easy to produce. She was photographed with grandchildren and with dogs, and in the specific domestic informality that public figures deploy when they want their coverage to carry the character of the human rather than the institutional. The management of her image across those years was more accomplished than it had been in the Bolland era, partly because the management's techniques had been refined across the decade of their operation, and partly because the passage of time had done the specific work that time does in the public's emotional relationship with events whose emotional intensity diminishes across years in ways that no management operation can accelerate, but that management operations can accompany and direct. By 2015, 20 years after the Camillagate tape, Camilla's public approval ratings were in positive territory for the first time in the modern polling record. The bread rolls were extraordinarily distant. Alongside this, something was happening inside the royal family that the rehabilitation campaign had not been designed to manage, and would eventually produce the most significant institutional challenge to the rehabilitation's completion. Harry met Meghan Markle in 2016 through a mutual friend who arranged a blind date. He was 31. She was 35. An American actress whose career had produced a substantial public profile in North America through 7 seasons of the legal drama Suits, and through various charitable and advocacy commitments she had maintained alongside her acting work. In the United Kingdom, she was essentially unknown in the way that American cable television actors are often essentially unknown in countries where the specific show has not achieved wide domestic broadcast reach. The relationship developed with speed. Harry's documented public statements from the period between the relationship becoming public in November 2016 and the engagement announcement in November 2017 show someone who had made the decision about the relationship's direction relatively quickly and who was not approaching its management with the institutional caution that the palace's communications apparatus would have preferred. The statement he issued from Kensington Palace in November 2016, condemning the coverage Meghan had been receiving since the relationship became public, was notably direct. It named the racism in the tabloid coverage explicitly. It named the misogyny. It did these things in plain language, without the management circumlocutions that the palace's press office typically employed when addressing tabloid behavior. The directness was remarked upon. It was the statement of someone who had decided that the management conventions of the palace's press relationships were not adequate to the specific situation, and who was declining to work within those conventions on this specific occasion. The engagement was announced in November 2017. The wedding took place at Windsor Castle on the 19th of May 2018 and was watched by an estimated 2 billion people globally. A figure reflecting the specific combination of Harry's standing in the British public's affection, built across years of military service in Afghanistan, where he had served 2 combat tours, his charitable work particularly around mental health and wounded veterans, and his consistent public persona of a prince who was warm and direct, and possessed of a humor that his brother's more formal public image did not reproduce. Added to that was Meghan's American celebrity and the broader global interest in a royal wedding that was, by virtue of Meghan's background, a specific cultural moment in the history of the British monarchy. The press coverage of the wedding was comprehensive and largely warm. The coverage of the period that followed was substantially different, and the difference is one of the documented facts of the Harry and Meghan years that does not require Harry's specific account of its causes to be established as real. Academic researchers documented it contemporaneously. Dr. Danielle Parsons and colleagues at the Reuters Institute at Oxford published analysis in 2020 examining the specific pattern of British tabloid coverage of Meghan Markle and finding it significantly more negative than the coverage of comparable royal figures, with the negative characterizations appearing with a frequency and a consistency that the research described as inconsistent with the neutral application of journalistic judgment to observable behavior. The racial dimension of the coverage deserves specific acknowledgement here because it is a documented element of the coverage pattern that the academic research identified and that Harry's public statements and Spare's text both name explicitly. Meghan Markle was the first person of color to become a member of the working British royal family in the modern era. Her arrival produced coverage in sections of the British press that was racially coded in ways that journalism academics who examined it identified in specific terms. References to her background as almost straight out of Compton from a commentator on a national television program. References to her having exotic DNA in coverage that deployed the word in the specific way it is deployed when the characteristic being described is racial origin. The specific register of coverage that framed her ancestry and family background as features requiring explanation in ways that the backgrounds of white members who had married into the royal family had not required. Harry's November 2016 statement had named this directly. The naming had not stopped the pattern. The specific characterizations that appeared in the British tabloids during the period from approximately mid-2018 through 2019 were organized around themes. Meghan as difficult to work with, as demanding of staff in ways that produced friction and resignations, as insufficiently respectful of royal convention, as cold toward specific family members, as a disruptive presence whose arrival had introduced tensions into working relationships that had previously functioned smoothly. These stories appeared attributed to the standard institutional attribution language: palace sources, sources close to the family, senior royal aides. This is the language that tabloid journalism uses for briefings from people inside the institutional world who are providing information about the people they work with or work around, and who require the attribution language to provide that information without being traceable as its source. The specific question Harry addresses in Spare, in the sections concerning Camilla, and in the sections concerning the palace's communications apparatus more broadly, is the question of which people inside the institutional world were providing those briefings, and what their motivation was. He describes Camilla as dangerous. The word appears in the context of his account of his understanding of what was happening to his and Meghan's public image during this period, and what he believed was producing it. He does not use the word in the register of personal physical threat. He uses it in the institutional register, the description of someone whose ambition toward a specific institutional goal has produced a willingness to conduct specific operations in service of that ambition, regardless of the specific costs to the people the operations are directed against. The institutional goal Harry identifies is the completion of the rehabilitation. By 2018, the rehabilitation had been underway for 20 years and had produced substantial progress. Camilla's approval ratings were in positive territory. The bread roll episodes were long in the past. The coverage of Camilla as a working royal was the coverage of a working royal rather than the coverage of a scandal. But what remained, in 2018, was the specific public sensitivity around the succession, around the question of whether the woman publicly identified as the cause of Diana's suffering would eventually be crowned alongside Charles. That specific sensitivity remained active in the constituency of the British public, for whom Diana's memory was still personally significant. Before examining the mechanism Harry describes, it is worth noting what he is and is not claiming in the relevant sections of Spare. He is not claiming that Camilla is a personally malevolent person who derives satisfaction from causing harm to others. He is not alleging that her warmth in her charitable work is performed, or that her genuine qualities as a companion to Charles are manufactured for institutional purposes. The account Harry gives is consistent with someone who is genuine in the personal qualities that 30 years of managed coverage have documented, and who is simultaneously willing, in the specific context of managing the completion of the rehabilitation, to conduct institutional operations whose consequences for specific other people, she has concluded, are an acceptable cost of achieving the institutional goal. That specific combination, genuine personal qualities coexisting with institutional conduct that produces harmful consequences for others, is the combination that characterizes most institutional management, rather than being unusual to Camilla's specific situation. It characterizes most of the people this account has described, operating within the institutional architecture of the royal family's management of its public image. The press officers who maintained the cover around the affair, in the 1980s, were not personally malevolent. The editors who declined to print the story were not personally malevolent. They were people operating within an institutional architecture whose incentives produced conduct whose consequences for specific individuals were harmful, without the people producing the conduct having to confront the harm in the direct personal terms that would require them to identify themselves as causing it. Harry's account places Camilla within that same institutional architecture rather than outside it as a uniquely malevolent actor. The placing within the architecture is, in some ways, the more precise and more serious characterization. Harry describes the specific mechanism through which he believes the briefing operations worked. It is not the mechanism of direct press contact, Camilla herself telephoning journalists to provide damaging information. It is the indirect mechanism of the social network, through which information from inside the royal household moves into press coverage, without the information's source being directly traceable. Camilla's social circle was the circle she had inhabited for decades, a circle that moved inside the aristocratic and upper-class world that the royal family's extended social sphere overlapped with. The members of that circle spoke to journalists in the specific way that people in those social worlds speak to journalists, without explicit attribution, but with sufficient specificity that the information they provide can be used in coverage attributed to the institutional categories that tabloid journalism deploys. Harry alleges in Spare that specific stories about Meghan that appeared in the British press could be traced back to briefings that originated with or through people connected to Camilla's circle, and that the stories were stories that served Camilla's rehabilitation narrative. By making Harry and Meghan the problem, the source of tension, the disruptive presence in a family that would otherwise have been functioning harmoniously, in ways that redirected press attention from the remaining sensitivities around the succession toward material that the rehabilitation narrative could accommodate. The specific sections of Spare, most relevant to Camilla, are sections that Harry presents not as isolated incidents but as a pattern. The same pattern repeating across different occasions and different publications in ways that he argues are inconsistent with the neutral application of journalistic judgment, and are consistent with a managed briefing operation with a consistent source and consistent interests. The pattern he describes has specific structural features. The information that appeared in the unflattering stories about Meghan was information that required insider access to the specific private communications of the royal family. Details of conversations, details of internal disputes, details of Meghan's interactions with palace staff that could only have been known to people inside those specific settings. The level of specificity told Harry, he writes, something about the distance of the source from the events being described. The information was not the information of someone who had heard a general account from someone who knew someone who had been present. The information was the information of someone who had been present, or who had direct access to someone who had been present. The second structural feature Harry describes is the consistency of the direction. The information was consistently information that made Harry and Meghan look difficult, unreasonable, or problematic, while maintaining positive or neutral coverage of the other working members of the royal family. A random distribution of unflattering coverage, generated by a press corps doing its job without institutional direction, would be expected to produce unflattering coverage distributed across the various members of the working royal family in rough proportion to the incidents and behavior available for unflattering coverage across all of them. The specific concentration of unflattering coverage on Harry and Meghan was inconsistent with that expectation. The third structural feature Harry describes is the specific publications in which the coverage appeared. The coverage was concentrated in specific tabloid publications, whose relationships with the palace's communications apparatus were the relationships that the rehabilitation campaign had developed and maintained across the previous 2 decades. Coverage appearing in those specific publications was coverage appearing in publications whose editorial decisions were most susceptible to influence by the palace's communications operations, for the specific reason that those publications were most dependent on the access relationships with the palace that the communications operations managed. He describes what he calls a leak and deny culture within the palace's communications apparatus. Information flowing from institutional sources toward specific tabloid publications, the information producing coverage that damaged the people it concerned, and the palace's official communications then denying any official involvement in the coverage that the unofficial briefings had produced. He describes specific occasions when information that could only have come from inside the family's private communications appeared in tabloid coverage in ways that indicated the information's source had access to conversations Harry and Meghan believed were private. Spare was published on the 10th of January 2023. It sold approximately 1.4 million copies on its first day in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, a first-day non-fiction sales record in those markets. The commercial scale of the response was not incidental to its significance. It was evidence of a public that wanted to read what a senior member of the royal family had to say about the institution from inside. The palace's response was brief and carefully worded. The matters raised were described as matters of great sadness that would not be discussed in public. No specific allegation was addressed in specific terms. No detailed rebuttal was produced. The official position was managed silence, the dignified non-engagement that the institution had developed, across exactly the 30 years of the rehabilitation campaign. As its standard response to accounts of itself, it preferred not to be in the public record. The decision not to engage in specific terms was a calculated choice. Detailed engagement would have required addressing specific allegations in ways that either confirmed or denied specific facts, and either outcome carried risks that the management calculation found prohibitive. Confirming specific facts would have validated Harry's account in ways the institution found unacceptable. Denying specific facts in specific terms would have required producing documentary evidence of the denial. Internal communications, briefing records, the specific evidence required to rebut specific allegations, whose disclosure the palace preferred not to make. The silence was therefore the strategic choice rather than the default response. The strategic character of the silence is itself a piece of evidence in the overall accounting, not proof of the allegation's truth, but evidence of the specific institutional calculation that found detailed public engagement with Harry's specific claims to be a worse option than managed non-response. The British tabloid coverage of Spare, in the weeks following its publication, was coverage organized predominantly around the question of Harry's reliability as a narrator rather than around the content of what he was narrating. This is the specific move that institutions make when the specific content of an allegation is difficult to rebut directly. Redirecting the conversation toward the character of the person making the allegation rather than the nature of the allegation itself. Harry was described as bitter, as unreliable, his memory of specific incidents challenged on specific factual grounds in several documented cases. He was described as motivated by grievance and by financial interest, and by the specific desire to rehabilitate Meghan's public image at his family's expense. Some of those characterizations may have contained elements of accuracy. The question of a memoir's specific factual accuracy is a legitimate question that every memoir's readers are entitled to weigh. What is also a legitimate question is whether the specific coverage that resulted from the palace's management of the response was organized around those legitimate questions, or whether the legitimate questions served as the vehicle for a broader management strategy whose primary goal was institutional protection rather than accuracy. The pattern of the coverage, consistently directing attention toward Harry's character and away from the content of his specific allegations about the briefing operations, is the pattern of institutional management, rather than the pattern of disinterested examination of a memoir's claims. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The question this account has been building toward throughout its preceding sections is not primarily the question of whether Harry's specific allegations about Camilla's press conduct are accurate in every specific detail. That question cannot be resolved from the public record in its current form, because the evidence required for that resolution resides in the private communications of the people involved. In the specific conversations, the specific briefing calls, the specific social occasions at which information moved from inside the institutional world toward the publications that used it. That evidence is inside the institutional world, and the institutional world has organized itself to prevent its disclosure with the legal and administrative mechanisms developed across 30 years of exactly this kind of management. The question this account has been building toward is the prior and more answerable question. Why, given that the knowledge Harry was describing was not confined to Harry, did nobody with standing say it before he did? The category of people who understood what Harry was describing is not a small category. It includes journalists who had received briefings through the networks Harry describes, and who understood, at the level of professional knowledge that sustained contact with institutional information sources produces, where the briefings originated. A specific illustration of how this kind of institutional knowledge works in the press world that covered the royal family across this period is useful here. A journalist covering the royal family, who receives information from a source attributed as close to the royal family, or senior palace aide, understands that this attribution language describes a real person with a real institutional position, whose identity the journalist knows or has a reasonable basis for inferring. The attribution language is the public face of a relationship that the journalist and the source both understand in specific terms. The journalist knows who the source is, or has a strong basis for believing they know. The source knows the journalist knows. Both parties operate within the understanding that the attribution language provides the cover that prevents the relationship from being directly traceable, while allowing the relationship to produce coverage that serves the source's interests. This is not cynical in a simple sense. It is the standard operating practice of institutional journalism in every domain, where sources have interests in the direction of coverage, and where the attribution language provides the cover that sustains the relationship over time. The Royal Press Corps was operating within institutional journalism's standard practice. What was specific about the Royal Press Corps' version of that practice was the degree to which the access relationships that sustained it were controlled by a single institution, the palace, whose interests in the direction of the coverage were organized around the specific requirements of managing the public image of the monarchy. The journalists who received briefings from what Harry describes as the Camilla camp were not uniquely ignorant of where the briefings were coming from. They were operating within the standard practice of their professional world, in a situation where the specific origin of specific briefings was something they understood, but that the attribution conventions of their profession and the access relationships of their professional position required them not to disclose. The knowledge was there. The practice required it not to be made public. The practice is the institutional architecture that produces the silence. The category of people who understood what Harry was describing is not a small category. It includes journalists who had received briefings through the networks Harry describes, and who understood, at the level of professional knowledge that sustained contact with institutional information sources produces, where the briefings originated. It includes former palace staff who had been inside the communications apparatus and had seen its operations from positions closer than any journalist's position. It includes members of the extended royal household who had watched the Meghan coverage develop in 2018 and 2019 with the specific awareness of people who understood how institutional coverage was produced. It includes the biographers who had spent years documenting the rehabilitation campaign and who had developed, through that research, a detailed understanding of the specific mechanisms the campaign had employed. None of them said it publicly in the specific terms Harry said it. The categories of reason for the silence are worth examining individually because they reveal the structure of the institutional architecture that Harry eventually broke through. The former palace staff who had observed the operations from inside were bound by the confidentiality agreements that royal household employment produced. The specific legal architecture of those agreements had been developed and refined across the decades since the early 1990s, when a series of published memoirs by former royal employees had motivated the palace's legal team to produce agreements whose scope and enforceability the palace believed would prevent similar publications. The agreements were not perfectly effective. Harry's own book is the most obvious evidence of that. But they were effective enough to prevent most people in the relevant position from providing the specific attributed testimony that would have placed what they knew in the public record in a form the palace could not manage through the non-response strategy. The journalists who had received briefings through the networks Harry describes were in the institutional position that the access calculation produces. Writing in specific terms about where specific briefings originated would have required disclosing the relationship that had produced the information in ways that would have damaged both the relationship and the journalist's future access to the information network the relationship represented. The same calculation that had produced the silence around the affair in the 1980s produced the silence around the briefing operations in 2018 and 2019. The specific subject of the calculation had changed. The structure of the calculation had not. The members of the extended royal household and the royal family's advisory circle, who had their own views about what was happening to Harry and Meghan's coverage, were people whose public standing was tied to the institution that was managing the coverage. Writing publicly about the institution's internal management operations would have required writing about the institution in terms that the institution found damaging, and the consequences of doing so for people whose public standing had an institutional character were consequences that the calculation found prohibitive. Harry had a structural difference from every other person who understood what he was describing. He had left. The January 2020 announcement that Harry and Meghan were stepping back from royal duties, formalized across the following months in negotiations about the specific terms of their departure, was the announcement of someone who had concluded that the institutional calculation no longer constrained him in the way it constrained the people who remained inside the institution. The departure did not eliminate costs. It changed which costs were operative. He was no longer inside the institution whose management he was going to describe, which meant that the specific institutional costs of that description, the access relationships, the confidentiality obligations, the standing inside the institutional world, had been paid already in the act of leaving, rather than remaining available as threatened consequences that might have modified the decision to write. He retained the costs of the family relationships. His relationship with his brother was documented, through the period between the departure and the book's publication, as having deteriorated to the degree that public reports described them as estranged in any practical sense. The specific character of the estrangement between Harry and William has been the subject of extensive press coverage since 2019, and the coverage has been organized, in the British tabloids, around a narrative of Harry as the party responsible for the estrangement, and William as the aggrieved party who has had to manage a difficult family situation produced by his brother's choices. The specific narrative is the narrative that the institutional management of the coverage required, William as the reliable working royal whose commitment to his duties had not wavered, Harry as the defector whose departure had introduced the specific rupture in the family's public unity that the departure had produced. The specific content of what the estrangement consisted of, as documented in the public record that Harry's various public statements and Spare itself produced, was a set of specific disagreements about the institutional management of Harry and Meghan's public image and the palace's response to the briefing operations Harry was identifying. Harry describes specific conversations with William about specific incidents in which he raised his concerns and in which the conversations produced outcomes he found inadequate. Whether William's understanding of those conversations matches Harry's account of them is a question the public record cannot answer, because William has maintained, through the years from the departure to the coronation, the institutional management convention of not speaking publicly about the matters Harry has described in specific terms. The maintained silence on William's side and the specific public account on Harry's side are the two pieces of the public record about their relationship across this period. The silence is consistent with the institutional calculation that this account has been describing throughout. The calculation that the cost of the naming is higher than the cost of the silence, for someone who remains inside the institution. William remains inside the institution. He made the calculation that this account has been describing. The calculation produced the silence. Harry made a different calculation. He left and he named what he had found. The naming is in the record. The silence is in the record. The reader can examine both. He retained the costs of the family relationships. His relationship with his brother was documented through the period between the departure and the book's publication as having deteriorated to the degree that public reports described them as estranged in any practical sense. His relationship with his father, now king, was the relationship of two people managing the public and private dimensions of a family situation that Harry's public statements had made more complicated than it had been before. These costs were real and were documented in the public reporting about the family's dynamics across the years between the departure announcement and the coronation. The broader question the spare publication generated, in the circles where the relationship between the royal family and the press is understood in the terms this account has been describing, was not primarily whether Harry's account was accurate. The question that the people with institutional knowledge of the situation found most significant was the question this account has been examining throughout. Why was Harry the first person with standing to say it? The answer, assembled from the categories of reason for silence examined above, is that Harry was the first person with standing to say it, because he was the first person with standing who had made the calculation that the cost of the silence was higher than the cost of the naming. Every other person who understood what he was describing had made the opposite calculation. Not because the opposite calculation was dishonest, but because the institutional architecture the rehabilitation campaign had operated within for 30 years produced, for each person inside that architecture, a specific set of costs associated with the naming that exceeded the costs they faced by remaining silent. The corroborating evidence for the general pattern Harry describes, assembled from sources independent of Harry's account, is substantial. The documented history of the rehabilitation campaign establishes that the palace's communications apparatus operated the specific mechanisms Harry describes: managed press relationships, indirect briefings, the provision of material through social networks in ways that produced coverage whose origin in the institutional world was not directly traceable, as standard operating practice across the 30 years of the campaign. The academic research on the Meghan coverage pattern establishes that the pattern was inconsistent with the neutral application of journalistic judgment, in ways that suggested the pattern was being shaped by institutional sources with specific interests in its direction. The institutional non-response to Harry's specific allegations establishes that the palace did not produce the specific documentary rebuttal that would have been available if the specific allegations were false in the specific terms Harry stated them. None of that is proof of Harry's specific allegations in specific terms. It is corroboration of the general pattern and the general mechanism he described, coming from sources that examined those things from outside rather than from the inside position he had occupied. The coronation itself, as a piece of choreographed institutional production, rewards examination for what it communicated about the rehabilitation's completion and what it chose not to communicate about the history that preceded it. The ceremony in Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May 2023 was the first coronation in the United Kingdom in 70 years. Its design drew on the traditions of coronations going back centuries while incorporating specific contemporary elements. The guest list did not include Prince Harry's sustained presence. He attended the service and departed for the United States on the same day, citing his son Archie's 4th birthday. The birthday was real. The decision to prioritize it over remaining for the celebratory events that followed the coronation service communicated something about the specific terms on which Harry understood his relationship with the institution to exist. Terms that had been produced by the years from January 2020 through January 2023, and that the institution's management of those years had not repaired in any practical sense. Camilla's coronation, in this context, was the completion of a narrative arc that began in the Windsor Great Park Polo Field in 1970 and ended in Westminster Abbey in 2023. The arc passed through every event this account has described: the early relationship, the marriages, the affair, the Morton book, the Camillagate tape, the panorama interview, Diana's death, the rehabilitation campaign, the 2005 wedding, the working royal years, the Queen's death, the accession, and terminated in the specific institutional outcome that the rehabilitation campaign had been organized to produce. The woman who had been the other woman was crowned queen. The narrative arc had a conclusion that the general public had not been told to expect in 1981, when the only narrative arc available in the public conversation was the narrative arc of Charles and Diana. That arc's conclusion, when it arrived, was the conclusion the rehabilitation had produced across 30 years of sustained management. The management worked. This is the fact whose acknowledgement is necessary before any analysis of what it cost is meaningful. Camilla Parker Bowles is Queen of the United Kingdom. She performs the public functions of her position with the consistency and the apparent ease of someone who has found the role she occupies genuinely congenial. The public opinion of her, while not enthusiastic in every quarter, is no longer organized primarily around the hostility that produced the bread roll incidents. The rehabilitation succeeded. What the rehabilitation produced, and what the record now contains alongside its production, is the account of what was managed to produce it. The affair, and what it cost Diana, is in the record. The Camillagate tape is in the record. Diana's panorama interview is in the record. The Morton biography's account of Diana's experience is in the record. The specific operations of the rehabilitation campaign, as documented by the biographers who examined them from outside, are in the record. And Harry's spare account of the specific later operations is in the record, with the specific allegations that the record cannot confirm or deny in their specific terms, but that it can place in the context of the documented pattern, for anyone who examines the context with the attention the context requires. The record contains both the rehabilitation and the account of what the rehabilitation cost. It contains the managed public version and the private version, assembled from the testimony of the people inside the management. It contains the institutional production and the specific naming of that production by the person who was in a position to name it and who made the calculation that naming it was worth the specific costs the naming would produce. The broader significance of what Harry did in Spare, beyond the specific allegations about Camilla's conduct, is the significance of a person with standing inside an institution, choosing to place a documented account of that institution's management practices in the permanent public record. This is a different thing from a disgruntled former employee providing unflattering gossip to a journalist. It is a different thing from the anonymous sourcing that produces the kind of press coverage whose institutional origins can be speculated about but not documented. It is a memoir by a person who identifies himself, who presents himself as the source of the account he is giving, and who accepts the specific personal costs of that identification in the form in which those costs arrive: the family relationship costs, the public image costs, the institutional costs, without the deniability that anonymous or indirect forms of the same communication would have provided. The specific form of the naming, the identified memoir, is what made Spare a different category of communication from the previous 2 decades of press coverage that had made the same general allegations through the mechanism of unnamed sourcing. The coverage organized around unnamed palace sources saying unflattering things about Harry and Meghan, and the implied counter-narrative of unnamed sources saying the briefings were coming from specific institutional locations, had been circulating in the press world for years before Spare appeared. The allegations were not new. What was new was their appearance in a form that named its own source, that attributed the specific account to a specific person, and that was published in a format, the hardback book with a major commercial publisher, that the public record preserves with a permanence that press coverage does not always achieve. The permanence is the point. The institutional management of the rehabilitation campaign had operated, across its 30 years, on the assumption that the things it was managing could be kept out of the permanent public record in the specific form that Harry placed them there. The assumption had been valid for 30 years because no one with the standing and the willingness to provide the attributed account had produced one. Harry had both the standing and, after the departure in January 2020, the willingness. The combination was the combination the institutional management had not encountered across 30 years of managing accounts of itself. It preferred not to be in the public record. The institutional management's response to having finally encountered it was the response this account has described. The managed non-response. The coverage organized around Harry's reliability rather than the content of his account. The maintenance of the dignified silence that the palace had developed as its standard instrument. The instrument worked, in the sense that it managed the specific moment of the book's publication and the weeks following it. It did not work in the permanent sense, because the naming is in the record, and the record does not forget. What can be said with confidence, based on the available evidence assembled across this account, is the simple thing the account has been building toward from its opening paragraph. The cruelty was not a secret inside the relevant institutional world. The press relationships, the briefing networks, the management of coverage through the specific access arrangements that the palace's communications apparatus maintained. These things were known to the people who participated in them, in the manner that institutional practices are known to the people who operate within them, without requiring explicit discussion of their character or their consequences. The people who knew said nothing publicly, because the institutional architecture of the royal family's management of its press relationships produced, for each of them, a specific set of costs associated with the naming that exceeded the costs they faced by remaining silent. The former staff faced legal consequences. The journalists faced the loss of access relationships whose professional value exceeded the value of any single disclosure. The members of the extended household and advisory circle faced the institutional consequences of writing against an institution whose association gave their standing its value. The biographers faced the loss of the access that had allowed them to do the research that gave their work its documentary authority. The architecture is designed to produce this outcome. Not through explicit instruction or through conscious coordination among all the parties maintaining the silence, but through the specific distribution of costs and benefits that the institutional environment creates for each individual participant in it. The individual calculation produces the collective silence without any individual necessarily intending the collective outcome. This is how institutional silences are sustained across decades, without any individual orchestrator, and without any central coordination. The architecture does the work. The individuals inside the architecture make the individual calculation that the architecture makes rational, and the result is the collective silence. Understanding this architecture is necessary for understanding why Harry's breaking of the silence required not just courage but departure. The courage without the departure would not have been sufficient, because the costs that the architecture deploys against people who break the silence while remaining inside it are costs that the architecture can sustain indefinitely. Harry could not have said what he said in spare while remaining a working member of the royal family. The institutional consequences would have been immediate and severe. The departure was the prerequisite for the naming. The naming was not possible without the departure having already been made. This is what makes the book structurally significant beyond its specific content. It documents not just the specific conduct it alleges, but the specific mechanism through which that conduct had been kept from the public record. The mechanism of the institutional architecture that produces the individual calculation, that produces the collective silence. The documentation of the mechanism is the documentation of why the mechanism had worked for 30 years and why it required the specific combination of standing and departure that Harry represented to be broken. Harry had left. The specific costs that had produced the silence in everyone else were not operative in his situation in the same form. He accepted the different costs, the family relationship costs, the public image costs, the cost of being understood primarily through the institutional management of his image, rather than through the content of what he was saying, and produced the book. The book exists. The permanent public record contains it alongside the coronation photographs and the official accounts and the managed coverage of 30 years of rehabilitation, and the institutional response to the book that chose silence over specific engagement. Both are in there together. The naming and the thing named. The crown and the account of what the crown cost. The British public in 2023 has access to both. The institutional account, maintained across 30 years of managed coverage, sustained by the specific calculations of the specific people inside the institutional architecture who found the maintenance rational, and the named account that Harry's departure and his published memoir placed alongside it. The public that wishes to examine only the institutional account has the institutional account available. The public that wishes to examine the named account alongside the institutional account has both available in the permanent record. The public that wishes to examine the relationship between the two accounts, what the institutional account was organized to prevent being seen, and what the named account says was being hidden and at whose expense, has the material for that examination. The question of what the examination produces is the question that readers who undertake it will answer for themselves. This account has assembled the documented history and the documented testimony and the documented pattern of coverage and the documented institutional response to the challenging of that coverage, and has placed them alongside each other for the reader to examine with the attention the subject requires and the judgment it deserves. The judgment the subject deserves is not simple. Camilla Parker Bowles is now Queen. She is 75 years old. The arc of her life from 1970 to 2023 contains the specific relationship with Charles that the institutional requirements of his life had prevented from developing toward its natural conclusion in the early years, and the subsequent half-century of institutional management, some of it organized around the relationship's rehabilitation and some of it, according to Harry, organized around the management of coverage in directions that served that rehabilitation's completion at the expense of the people that coverage was directed against, that had produced the conclusion in the form the coronation expressed, and the subsequent decades of institutional management that had produced the conclusion in a different form and at a significant cost. What she is now, a working queen performing her constitutional role with the consistency and the commitment that the people who observe her official engagements consistently describe, does not erase what the path to becoming it required. What the path required does not erase what she is now. Both things are true simultaneously. The judgment the subject deserves accommodates both truths rather than requiring one to displace the other. Harry made his judgment and placed it in the public record. The public is entitled to make its own. The reader who examines the full record, without prior conviction about its conclusion, finds a picture that the managed account was not organized to make visible, the picture of the costs, as well as the achievement. Camilla's cruelty was never a secret. Harry was simply the first to say it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.